People coming in. I'll give people a little time to come in. Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started in a few minutes, but I want to make sure that people get in. So just a minute or two and okay, I kind of disappeared there for a minute.
I see you now.
Good. Okay, we are going to get started because I really value people's time. So good morning and happy Wednesday to each and every one of you. I am Beverly Lloyd. I am Dennis's wife. And unfortunately, he's unable to be here this morning because he's traveling. And in addition, Egypt is unable to be here because she is doing a project with her job. So it's my absolute pleasure to sit in for them today. So good morning. And I hope that the weather is good wherever you are. I am a little chilly in Atlanta, but we're ready for some chilly weather. It's been really hot here, but it's a glorious day. The sun is shining. So welcome, welcome this morning. I'm glad you're here to hear our speaker, Mr. Richard Cellini. But before I introduce Richard, I'm going to hand the mic over to Naomi, who has some information about upcoming events. So good morning, Naomi.
Good morning. Thank you, Beverly. Chilly here in Cambridge as well, but I'm not ready for winter personally. But with some announcements this morning. So there's a couple of events happening this weekend. So Saturday and Sunday, First Church's embroidery project titled Wade in the Water will be at the Rising Quilt Show at Arlington Town Hall. And that project was in honor and memory of the 36 enslaved persons owned by First Church members in the 17th and 18th centuries. I'll drop a link to that in a moment, and that'll be all day Saturday and Sunday from 10 to 5. Also this weekend, on Sunday, will be a lecture presented by the Brookline Historical Society titled Enslaved Individuals in Brookline's Old Burying Ground with historian Catherine Hendrick, and that'll be at 2 p.m. at Lyon Chapel at First Parish in Brookline. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that we did host our first community conversation on reckoning with local legacies of slavery at People's AME Church in Chelsea. I especially want to thank Reverend Sarah Smith and the Chelsea community for welcoming us, as well as Dennis Lloyd, Reverend Dan Smith, and Paula Paris for helping facilitate that conversation. It really was a wonderful evening. It brought together not only the church members, but the greater community, including school committee members, the Chelsea Police Department, and an organization called the Chelsea Black Community, or CBC. Really engaged conversation, and it makes me really excited to continue these conversations at other churches. And with that, I'll pass it back to Beverly to introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you so much, Naomi. Those sound like wonderful events, and I understand that last night was very well received. So thank you. Thank you very much for that. So everyone, hopefully you had an opportunity to read Richard's entire biography. And I'm just going to share a few bits of information about him. Richard is the founding director of the Harvard Slavery Remembrance Program at Harvard University in Cambridge, Mass. And the program identifies people enslaved by Harvard and its leaders between 1636 and 1900 and locates their direct descendants. Richard is also the founder and leader of the Georgetown Memory Project, which is an independent research institute that identifies persons enslaved by Georgetown University and traces their direct descendants. And lastly, Richard is an attorney, a business executive, and scholar on the history of slavery. He's married and he has 2 teenage children, and he just acquired a little dog. So sounds like he's getting ready to have some fun. But it is clear to me that Richard is doing very important work, and I know that we're all very excited and honored to have him speak to us this morning. So without further ado, Richard, I welcome you, and thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, it is. First of all, it's my honor. I mean, the coalition is doing amazing work, and in really a very short period of time has established a footprint that of scholarship and service and community engagement that nobody's really ever seen before. So I really congratulate everybody here on the work that's being done. It's just so vital. I mean. My good friend Professor Vincent Brown is on the phone, and yesterday we were talking about the fact that so much of what people know about the history of slavery just isn't so, because we've never been properly taught. And I can't say enough about how important your work is and how meaningful it is that you're reteaching, or perhaps teaching for the first time, the true history of slavery. I've had the pleasure of visiting with Dennis in Egypt and their family. And I really, in addition to being honored, I just feel very at home here. I see a lot of friends that new and old that are on here this morning. And it's just so nice to be among friends to discuss this topic. I mean, sometimes people say this is a difficult conversation. And I always say, well, difficult for who? For some families, this is a conversation that's, just sort of part of the fabric of their family and their family discussions and their family history. Other people are newer to it, and perhaps it is more difficult. But regardless, it's always easier to do these presentations when you're among friends, and I really appreciate the warmth and the welcome that I've received here. I am the founder of the Harvard Slavery Remembrance, or the founding director of the Harvard Slavery Remembrance Program. Happy to talk about our work there. But instead, I thought, rather than focusing on that, just as the coalition is focused on, slavery in general, I too have an interest in the subject that includes Harvard, but goes far beyond Harvard. And I thought what we would do is talk about the case at Georgetown University, because it provides sort of a soup to nuts overview of what can happen when a university, an elite Eastern university, kind of reckons with its history of slavery. So that's my plan today. I mean, there are obviously parallels or lessons, both positive and negative, that people could draw to Harvard and other institutions. So I just offer it as a case study, and we'll be happy to answer questions about the Georgetown experience. To start, I'm going to try to share my slides. Hoping people can see that. Is that up for everybody?
No, we don't see that yet.
Okay. How about now?
Yes.
Okay. And I just tell people, it's been 3 years that we're on Zoom and the product isn't getting any better. It's just getting worse. Anyway, as the slide says, my subject this morning is a search for Georgetown University's enslaved people. It's about it's a story about approximately 1,500 men, women, and children who were enslaved by Georgetown University and the Maryland Jesuits from the period 1634 to 1864. It includes the very famous subset known as the GU 272 ancestors. These were the enslaved people who were sold in 1838 by the Maryland Jesuits and Georgetown to rescue Georgetown from bankruptcy in 1838. But it's really sort of, there'll be a lot of focus on the GU 272 because we know a lot about that group, and they're relatively close to us in time. But many of the lessons and conclusions and observations applied really to the whole group of 1,500 men, women, and children who were enslaved by Georgetown and the Maryland Jesuits. The presentation really has three parts. I just sort of briefly want to provide some context about why this topic matters, especially to the descendants of people who were once enslaved by the Maryland Jesuits. This group needs no context or background from me. I just want to share with you my own sense of the context and my own kind of appreciation over time of how this is relevant to descendants and descendant communities. Secondly, and this is really the bulk of the presentation, I want to tell you a story, and that's the story of a particular group of people who were enslaved by a particular university, Georgetown, and that university's particular efforts to grapple with its past. And then finally, I'll be happy to take questions for as long as people like. And also, I think the team that put together the call is welcome to share my email address with anybody. We're all friends. Please just, if you have a wish for a longer conversation or more detailed questions, just get my email address and I'll be happy to engage with you outside of this call, obviously. So to start with why this topic matters, I want to talk about it from the standpoint of the descendants of the people who were once enslaved by Georgetown and the Maryland Jesuits. This is sort of just a way I like to talk about it. There are many, many ways you can talk about this, but I show this to a lot of audiences, and I say that if you look back 6 generations, each and every one of us has 126 ancestors. So let's say that 6 generations back, just one of your ancestors was enslaved. It would be wrong for people to shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's only 1/126th of your ancestry. And I'd like to just briefly talk about why. Slavery put your ancestors' life in extreme jeopardy at all times. And these two charts show the effect of the premature death of just one of those ancestors 6 generations back. So the chart on the left shows what happens if your enslaved ancestor survives. It all sort of cascades down to you being alive in the present. But the chart on the right shows what happens if your enslaved ancestor dies prematurely. You can see that the erasure of a single enslaved ancestor has a ripple effect that reaches all the way down to the present. A premature death through the violence that was inherent in slavery erases not just your enslaved ancestor, but you as well. And so I like to tell people, audiences, broad audiences that are interested in this topic, if you go back 6 generations, we all have 126 ancestors, but not a single one to spare. Not a single one to spare. And now I want to sort of jump into the story part, and this is the story for the most part about the so-called GU 272 ancestors. This is more than 300 enslaved people who were sold to southern Louisiana in 1838 in order to rescue Georgetown University, then known as Georgetown College, from bankruptcy. And these are the people who made Georgetown University possible. And also many other Catholic schools, colleges, and universities in the United States as well. I just briefly before we go on, I say at Harvard, and I've said at Georgetown many times, that these institutions are warming themselves by a fire they didn't build and drinking from a well they didn't dig. And today this story is about the people and the families who actually did build that fire and dig that well, and not just for that institution, but certainly in the case of Georgetown, but for many other sort of offspring spin-off institutions as well. This story begins in 1634 when Catholicism, the Catholic religion, arrived in British North America, specifically when an order of Catholic priests known as the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus, arrived in southern Maryland. When the Jesuits landed in America, they brought indentured servants with them, and they probably acquired African American enslaved people shortly thereafter. When the Jesuits settled in Maryland, they built and operated plantations. There were 5 plantations in all. These were tobacco plantations, but they were, more importantly, from our perspective, slave plantations, or more precisely, we call them plantations, but more precisely, they were slave labor camps. And these slave labor camps were operated for the sole purpose of funding the mission of the Jesuit order in North America. So between 1634 and 1864, the Jesuits enslaved approximately 1,500 people in these slave labor camps. And here I'm showing you on the map of Maryland the location of the Jesuit slave plantations, known in an area today that's known as sort of the Great Tobacco Coast of the Chesapeake. You can sort of see they're clustered around the Potomac River and also the Chesapeake Bay. Nowadays, we would think, oh, well, you sort of take Route 50 out to Annapolis and then you drop down. But that's not how people navigated when these plantations were founded. They were navigating by water, and the Great Tobacco Coast of the Chesapeake was made vital by these waterways, vital and functional, and that would be the Potomac River and also the Chesapeake Bay. By the way, the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, the Maryland Jesuits, still own many of these properties today. It's not advancing. Okay. In the 1780s, the Jesuits decided to establish the first Catholic university in America, and this is the university that we know today as Georgetown University. Georgetown College admitted its first student in 1791. Actually, very few outside donations were received. Georgetown College, now Georgetown University, was financed almost exclusively with proceeds from the Jesuit slave labor camps. All of Georgetown's earliest buildings were built by enslaved people. For the next 50 years, Georgetown's operating costs were covered entirely with revenue generated from the 5 Jesuit slave plantations. In fact, Georgetown itself, these are pictures of Georgetown. This is Georgetown 50 years later in the 1830s. Georgetown itself owned and kept slaves on its college campus, and in many ways, Georgetown College was the 6th plantation, sort of right up the Potomac. It was just the furthest one up. Until the mid-1830s, Georgetown educated students for free. No tuition was charged. These lucky students were young, white Catholic men. Mostly, they were the sons of wealthy Southern planters and slave owners. Basically, over a period of more than 50 years, Georgetown was founded, built, and operated entirely with funds generated by enslaved labor. All of the enslaved people were baptized Roman Catholics, and the Jesuits called them the family. By the mid-1830s, Georgetown was on the verge of financial collapse. So the Jesuits, which I have to say really takes some doing. People say slavery wasn't profitable. Actually, slavery was largely nothing but profit. What's not profitable is slave owners not working and not charging tuition and not earning any money. That's not profitable. But slavery itself was immensely profitable and kept Georgetown afloat for its initial 50 years. But by the mid-1830s, the college was on the verge of financial collapse, and it's sort of largely understood it's because there were too many members of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, sort of hanging on and being, commercially unproductive to the point that it really threatened to sort of crush the whole system. And so anyway, the Jesuits decided that the right move was to sell their enslaved people outright for cash. So that it wasn't to, sell the plantations, it wasn't to charge tuition, at least not initially. It was to sell the enslaved people. So in June of 1838, the Jesuits signed an agreement which you see here on the screen, to sell what they described as 272 men, women, and children for a total of $115,000. So that's about 3.3 million in today's money, but if you add in compound interest, it's about $3.3 billion. At any rate, it was many multiples of the annual budget of Georgetown College, and it certainly was more than enough to rescue the college from bankruptcy. But the sale agreement, which you see here, is 8 pages long. Actually, each and every one of the enslaved people is listed by name, gender, and age. 50% of them were children. William was just 6 months old. Daniel was more than 80. 3 men were named Nace. This is short for Ignatius, and of course, Ignatius Loyola was the founder of the Society of Jesus. Len was sickly, Stephen was lame, and Betsy was married to Sam. It's just a little bit about what we know about this community of enslaved people through this document alone. Anyway, in the end, the Jesuits sold a total of 314 enslaved people during the period 1838 to 1843, and collectively they're known today as the GU 272 ancestors. The GU 272 ancestors were sent to 3 different sugar plantations located in southern Louisiana. There were 5 ship voyages in all between 1838 and 1843. This wasn't just sort of a bad day and a bad decision by Georgetown College or the Maryland Jesuits. This was an enormous undertaking that took 5 years to achieve. And it took the best lawyers and some of the best financial minds in New Orleans and Washington, D.C. and Southern Maryland to pull this off. And it involved the people at the highest level of Georgetown University. There's tons of correspondence about this. Again, it wasn't just, oops, my bad. In fact, in the early history of Georgetown College, there's no operation quite as extensive and quite as sophisticated as this 1838 sale of enslaved people. As I said, there were 5 ship voyages in all. Each voyage took about a month. They went by sea, and each of the voyages, as far as we can tell, ended in Algiers Parish in New Orleans. Until 2015, it was commonly believed that all but a very, very small number, maybe 6 of the GU 272 ancestors were sent to Louisiana. However, the Georgetown Memory Project has now established that actually only 217 of the GU 272 ancestors were actually sent to Louisiana, and 97 or approximately 100 were left behind in Maryland in 1838. Of course, they were all still enslaved. This was not winning the lottery. They remained enslaved. Some of them remained enslaved in Maryland. Some of them were briefly enslaved in Maryland and then sold on to parts of the country unknown. A relatively small but significant number did escape to freedom, but that's kind of the distribution. The 215, let's say 217 GU 272 ancestors who were shipped to southern Louisiana did not settle into happy, contented lives below the Mason-Dixon line. I know I don't have to say that here, but just every presentation I give, somebody comes up to me afterwards and says, but they were really happy, weren't they? And, no, there was no happy form of slavery. But, you don't have to take my word for it. I'm pausing here to share with you an eyewitness account of this group of people that occurred in a sighting in 1848. In 1848, a Maryland Jesuit, pictured here, accidentally crossed paths with a large group of former Maryland Missions enslaved people, Jesuit enslaved, on a plantation in Ascension Parish, Louisiana. He recognized them as the very people that had been enslaved in southern Maryland by the Jesuits in Georgetown, and he knew their whereabouts, and he met with a large assemblage of them at one evening after dinner. And here's what he wrote back to Georgetown about the people he met. He wrote, and I'm quoting, "They have scarcely any chance to attend to their religious duties. Some of the women told me weeping," and Father Van de Velde underlines the word weeping, "that they had not been to church for more than a year. Their children grow up without any notion of religion. These good people are now utterly neglected." This is the last eyewitness report of the GU 272 ancestors in Louisiana. Between 1848 and 2015, no one from Georgetown University or the Maryland Jesuits ever went looking for the GU 272 ancestors or their descendants. No one. Not a single person. Not once. Not ever. Let's say after 1864 or the Civil War, the Georgetown enslaved people had literally been pushed down the memory hole. In a sense, they had been murdered twice, once in body and a second time in name. Jesuit slaveholding, Jesuit Georgetown slaveholding remained largely forgotten until just about 10 years ago at this point. In the fall of 2015, it was actually undergraduate students at Georgetown University who organized protests to demand the renaming of two prominent campus buildings. Now, these buildings were very old, and they were located in the most historic part of campus. The buildings were named after two university presidents who were, as the custom dictated, two Roman Catholic priests. And specifically, they were the two priests who sold the GU 272 ancestors to Louisiana in 1838. Now, it had never been a secret at Georgetown that Georgetown owned enslaved people in its early years. But for almost everybody at Georgetown in the modern era, the details were fuzzy. And in 2015, the student protesters really brought this history into high focus. And again, that meant, helping people grapple with the factual reality. Facts are stubborn things, that more than 300 people, or approximately 300 people, were sold, and they were sold all at once. And they were sold to three sugar plantations in southern Louisiana, and they were sold to rescue Georgetown University from bankruptcy, and they were sold by the leadership of the Jesuits in the college. Again, the details had been fuzzy, but the students really placed this in almost high definition focus. Student protesters being student protesters, they had a list of demands. All of the demands were actually about Georgetown itself. So they were focused on things like the names of campus buildings and commemorative plaques on campus, and campus-wide educational events, and the script for the campus tour. Georgetown's president, in response, established an official working group to investigate this 1838 slave sale and to discuss what it all meant for Georgetown in the modern era. I'm an alumnus of Georgetown College, and Georgetown Law School. I love Georgetown very much. I'm nobody. I'm not rich. I'm not famous. I'm not powerful. But I did send an email to a senior member of Georgetown's working group, and I asked a single question. And actually, my question had nothing to do with Georgetown University. My question was this: what happened to the people? What happened to the more than 272 men, women, and children who were sold to southern Louisiana in 1838? The protesters' demands and topics and issues didn't strike me as trivial, but they didn't strike me as central either. To me, the central question was, what happened to the people? And as I said, even though I'm nobody, a few hours later, I received a reply. And here's what the email said. And I'm quoting: "Dear Richard, as far as we can tell, all of the GU 272 ancestors quickly succumbed to a fever in the malodorous swamp world of Louisiana," unquote. In other words, as best anybody knew at Georgetown in 2015, the GU 272 ancestors left no trace and no descendants either in Louisiana or Maryland. Now, as soon as I read this email, I thought that's just simply not possible. Even the Titanic had survivors. And that was the day the Georgetown Memory Project was born. Just briefly about the Georgetown Memory Project, which is really the least interesting part of this story. It's an independent nonprofit research institute. Our mission is to identify and locate the GU 272 ancestors and to trace their direct descendants, both living and deceased. Our work is carried out by a team of professional genealogists. We do our work in the courthouses, churches, libraries, and archives of Southern Louisiana and Southern Maryland. We receive no financial support whatsoever from Georgetown University, the Maryland Jesuits, or the Roman Catholic Church, and we're funded entirely by the generosity of individual donors. If you'd like to learn more about the Georgetown Memory Project, please visit our website at www.georgetownmemoryproject.org. Over the past 9 years, 10 years now, really, we have positively identified and located 238 of the GU 272 ancestors. As I said, we've located about 215, 217 GU 272 ancestors in Southern Louisiana. And we've also identified, I think at least 24 of the GU 272 ancestors who were left behind in Maryland in 1838. So for each and every one of these people, we've established a first and last name, and we can say with precision and specificity where they ended up after the 1838 sale and where they lived in the years and decades thereafter. And here's just some of what we know about the GU 272 ancestors as a group. First and foremost, there was no mass extinction of the GU 272 ancestors. 187 of them appear in the documentary record at least once at some point after the 1838 sale, but before 1865. 96 of them survived the Civil War. At least 8 of them served in the Civil War as Union soldiers. At least 21 of the GU 272 ancestors survived into the 20th century. In fact, the last living GU 272 ancestor died on April 3rd, 1924 in Smoke Bend, Louisiana. That was more than 85 years after the 1838 sale. Against all odds, we actually discovered photographs of one of the GU 272 ancestors, and you see them on your screen. This is an actual person sold by Georgetown University to Southern Louisiana in 1838. This is Frank Campbell. Frank Campbell was 24 years old when the Jesuits sold him to a sugar plantation in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. He remained enslaved until 1865. He married another member of the GU 272 ancestors in Louisiana and had children. Frank Campbell remained Roman Catholic his entire life. This picture was taken in about 1906 when Frank Campbell was 92 years old. And at the time, he was still living and working on a sugar plantation in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. Actually, this little girl, you see the two girls, this little girl they're both Frank Campbell's granddaughters. The smaller of the two children lived in Berkeley, California until her death in 2003. And I mean, it sort of shows you how close we are to the Georgetown enslaved people, that, there are people who knew this little girl when she was very old, obviously, in 2003, and she was the granddaughter of Frank Campbell, one of the people sold by Georgetown University. So, not only is the past not past, it's very present to many people, particularly the families of the enslaved people. As I said, our research has not been limited to the GU 272 ancestors. We produce Mayflower quality genealogical research as well. As of today, the Georgetown Memory Project has traced and verified more than 12,000 direct descendants living and deceased. Now, when I say direct descendants, I mean the son, grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson, or daughter of one of the Georgetown enslaved people. In other words, there's a straight line up. So I'm not talking about sort of collateral descendants, nothing wrong with collateral descendants. I'm just telling you the methodology we used. So it's not nieces or nephews or aunts and uncles and things like that, but just focusing on the direct lineage, it's more than 12,000 direct people. About 6,000 of them are alive today. In a great many instances, hundreds of cases, GU 272 descendants still live within a few miles of the plantations where their ancestors were enslaved in the years just after 1838. So, in other words, as Georgetown, sort of went from strength to strength, many of the people in these families have stayed essentially exactly where Georgetown left them in 1838. Really just a few yards or at most a few miles from the boundary lines of the plantations in southern Louisiana and southern Maryland, where they could be found in 1838. The GU 272 descendants, have, from a population standpoint, they look pretty much like the Georgetown Alumni Association. I mean, it's a bell curve. There are people from all walks of life, all economic, social, and educational levels. They're members of the Catholic religion, other religions, no religion at all. Anytime you're dealing with a population of this size, it's going to sort of look statistically normal. And indeed it does. I mean, I find myself constantly reminding people that, the same kind of variability you'll find in the Georgetown University Alumni Association, you'll find in the GU 272 community as well. All told, the Georgetown Memory Project has reconnected more than 1,000 modern day nuclear families with their historical roots, but more importantly with each other. A lot of these families are very closely related. They were indeed the family, as they were called by the Jesuits in the 1830s, and those family ties have been rediscovered and reconnected today. Here, I'd just like to show you some pictures of GU 272 descendants, largely without commentary, but I always find it valuable, I think, to put pictures with names, faces with names. In 2016, the GU 272 Descendants Association was founded by a leadership group of about 20 GU 272 descendants. Georgetown University and the Jesuits did not found this association, nor would it have been appropriate, in my view, for Georgetown or the Jesuits to found this association. This instead was an association founded by a leadership group of descendants. The GU 272 Descendants Association quickly grew to approximately 1,000 members from really nearly every part of the United States. The first family reunion of GU 272 descendants in the modern era was organized and held near Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was really just a couple of miles from one of the big three sugar plantations outside of Baton Rouge. That the GU 272 were sent to in 1838. More than 600 people attended, of all ages, very elderly people, middle-aged people, and teenagers, and even quite a number of youngsters. And I attended that. It was my privilege to attend that event, and I remember hearing over and over a saying that was adopted by the GU 272 descendants attending that reunion. And the saying is, they tried to bury us. They did not know that we were seeds. Near the end of 2016, the leadership of the GU 272 Descendants Association, pictured here, made first contact with the leadership of Georgetown University. Again, it's interesting. It was not, even though the university had months and months of advance notice down to sort of the names of individual leaders of the Descendants Association, it was not actually the university that took the initiative. It was the descendants who took the initiative. Here you see 4 of the leaders of the GU 272 Descendants Association speaking there on the right to Georgetown's president, Dr. Jack DeGioia. This occurred at a public meeting the university had called to discuss the results of its slavery working group. Even though the university knew that hundreds and hundreds of descendants had been found and knew that for months, no special invitation had been given to descendants. In fact, descendants found out about the gathering just 48 hours earlier, along with members of the general public. And I think everybody pictured here traveled from a different state, some as far away as Florida and Louisiana, just to attend this event. And this meeting, this first contact, if you will, occurred when Mr. Joseph Stewart, the descendant who's holding the microphone, during the Q&A period, asked if, instead of asking his question from the audience, if he could come up to the front of the room and pose the question directly to President DeGioia. And President DeGioia said yes, naturally. It is to be hoped, at least, that it was natural. And that was really the start of the conversation. But my point is, from the very start, the GU 272 descendants took the initiative and articulated a vision of repair. And it was based on a long-term partnership, an idea of a long-term partnership with Georgetown University and investments in a shared future. Just to show you how rocky it was at this stage, President DeGioia kept saying to the descendants in that room, believe me, Georgetown wants the descendants very much to be a living part of Georgetown's past. And one of the descendants, I think one of the ladies pictured here, said, well, President DeGioia, I don't really know what it means to be a living part of your past, but we want to be a living part of your present and your future. And that really kind of, came as a shock, I think, to the leadership of Georgetown, but it was a necessary shock, and it was a shock that was provided from the leadership of the descendants, and not the other way around. The Jesuits, a few months later, formally apologized to the descendants of all people who were enslaved by the Maryland Jesuits. Georgetown University itself has granted what's called legacy admissions preference to descendants of people who were once enslaved by the Jesuits. Now, this is not a guarantee of admission to Georgetown, and it's definitely not a scholarship or a financial aid grant. It's a leg up in the admissions process. Essentially, GU 272 descendants now receive the same admissions edge traditionally granted to the children of Georgetown alumni, faculty, staff, and major benefactors. Family at Georgetown, the Georgetown family, is a concept taken very seriously, and to President DeGioia's credit, it took some months, but President DeGioia's credit, he established and enshrined the principle that the Georgetown family certainly included this oldest branch of the Georgetown family, which is the descendants of the people who built the institution. In 2019, the undergraduate student body at Georgetown approved a referendum calling for financial reparations to the descendants of Georgetown Jesuit slaves. Their view was that, the undergraduate view was that slavery, particularly Georgetown Jesuit slavery, was always about the money. And this was not a time for it to cease to be about money. There was never a sense that slavery was somehow part of the educational mission or, the higher ideals of the college. It was always a purely financial matter to the college. And since the problem was financial in the 1830s, and the original injury was financial, the undergraduates put forth a referendum that essentially stated that since the injury was financial in nature, the remedy should be financial in nature. Anyway, this referendum actually passed 67% to 33%, and it passed in a student election that generated the highest turnout in decades. In response, Georgetown, the administration, I have to say, sort of hijacked the whole thing, but they did announce that the university would spend $400,000 annually on community initiatives that will benefit the descendants of GU 272 descendants. $400,000 a year is sofa change at an institution like Georgetown. It's not proportionate to the injury inflicted. Nevertheless, Georgetown did become the first major university in America to approve at the highest institutional level the payment of financial reparations to the descendants of enslaved people. More importantly, in 2021, Georgetown University and the Jesuits pledged to raise $100 million over a 5-year period to fund additional repair initiatives. This pledge was the result of several years of intense, ongoing negotiations between the leaders of the GU 272 Descendants Association, Georgetown University, and the Jesuit Order. And again, this was very, very, very much a descendant-led vision and a descendant-led process. The university was having and the Jesuits were having an extraordinarily difficult time getting out of their own way, and they were sort of the ones with big offices and big staffs and big salaries, but could not figure out, how to respond to this moment in history. And it was actually the descendants who, to an individual, were volunteers. Many of them retired, many of them with jobs, but families and children at home who, for multiple years, pushed this vision. And as you can see here from the New York Times headline, Georgetown and the Jesuits have pledged $100 million to atone for its complicity in slavery. To date, approximately $50 million has been raised and placed in trust for the descendant community, but the Jesuits and the university say that they're committed to funding the rest of it. At the same time this pledge was made, the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, a foundation, was created to hold and administer the funds pledged by Georgetown and the Jesuits. The board of trustees, again, this was a descendant-led vision. The board of trustees of the foundation is composed of representatives appointed by the descendants, the university, and the Jesuits. But the foundation's president and CEO is a descendant. And the foundation really has 3 principal missions. One is to facilitate racial transformation and healing across all populations in the United States, providing educational support, which is understood to be financial, to GU 272 descendants, whether they want to go to Georgetown or anywhere else, and supporting elderly and infirm GU 272 descendants, in other words, providing economic security to elderly descendants. The primary, and I'm just about done here, I just wanted to sort of, bring you to the current date. The primary, again, the foundation is only 50% funded so far. So the primary social program that the foundation is executing right now is a scholarship program. It provides annual college scholarships of up to $10,000 to certified descendants. So these are not just people who write in and say they think they're descendants, but people who genealogically can show their connection to. This is very important to the descendants. They object mightily to the idea of stolen valor. Their point is that their families actually that maybe anybody could have been enslaved by Georgetown and the Jesuits, but their families actually were enslaved by Georgetown and the Jesuits. And out of respect for the ancestors, they are very keen. This is part of the descendant-led vision, very keen that genealogical proof be provided when people obtain one of these scholarships. And the scholarships are tenable really anywhere in the United States. HBCUs, but also other institutions of higher learning. I mean, certainly one of the earliest lessons was that many people really had no interest in going to Georgetown University. These were families who had been relocated to Louisiana and, had gotten along for decades without anything from Georgetown University. And so, for a variety, some people do want to go to Georgetown. Some people actually apply and are admitted under the G272 Legacy Admissions Program, but there are many other places that people want to go to school as well. And these scholarships are tenable at all of those institutions. So I think this would probably be a good time to stop the formal part of the presentation. I do want to thank you again for letting me be here with you this morning, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have about Georgetown, or, I'm certainly conversant with similar initiatives at other universities and other institutions that are trying to make an effort at repair for past complicity in slavery. So I'll be happy to answer questions. I also don't assume that I'm the only person on the phone who can answer them. Some of your questions may be appropriate for somebody else. So we'll just open this up and have sort of a roundtable discussion, if that's all right.
Hey, Richard, thank you so much for that presentation. One of the things that, I learned a lot. I always learn a lot at these presentations, but the thing that most impacted me were those two charts that you had. About our ancestors, those deaths that were premature, and how when that happened, that wipes out a lot of the family. That was really, really, that was an eye opener for me.
Well, I appreciate it. I know it's a little analytical. I mean, I think the real significance is that, we love our ancestors. I mean,
absolutely.
And it can be summed up, and many people believe, as do I, since we're among friends, I don't mind saying this, that the ancestors call us by name to do this work. The ancestors, again, we're among friends, so I don't mind saying this, that, the ancestors regularly invade my dreams when and they work us hard. But some of this presentation is sort of, crafted towards, frankly, our white brothers and sisters who don't sort of know a lot about slavery. And so, I frequently used to get this kind of, well, it's only 101, 126 of your, ancestry. What's the big deal? And I was really kind of struggling to show people that, we don't have a single ancestor to spare. Each and every one of them was vital. And we're only here today because of the sacrifices and the survival of each and every one of those ancestors. It's very, very personal.
Anyone have any questions, any comments for Richard?
I have a question. I want to start off by saying, just thank you for that talk. That was absolutely gripping and just super, super interesting. I'm a history student right now, as well as an intern here. So just super interesting. Can you speak to more about why Georgetown made that decision to sell? I'd assume that having that number of slaves would still be profitable for them, and at least keeping a few would be. Is it just that they were in such dire financial straits that they needed a large number of people just for that much profit at that moment? Or is it just the writing was on the wall for slavery would be ending within a few decades anyways? Can you just speak to
Yeah,
more?
no, it's an excellent question, and I can tell right off the bat that you're an historian, so I think you'll appreciate the answer as well, which is it was the great credit contraction of 1835, known more generally as the Panic of 1837. So the financially savvy people saw it coming in 1835 because credit started shrinking. If you called it the Great Panic of 1837, it sort of meant you were already too late. You were like the recipient of the tsunami, not an early forecaster of it. But throughout the country, there was an enormous contraction in credit. There just simply was not, there was no currency. There was not a highly effective banking system, certainly not that we recognize today. So specie, cash, was king, and certainly credit was, if not king, crown prince. And so people sold what they had. And by the way, we see echoes of this in the Harvard story as well. There was a similar crescendo of complicity in slavery at Harvard in the 1830s, and it was occasioned by exactly the same set of facts. That's why I say, you know, this was always about the money. And these facts, I think, really establish that you know, the institution and the white people needed money, and so they sold the most valuable liquid assets they owned, which was the enslaved people. So it wasn't land, it wasn't agricultural products. The most liquid, market ready, and there was indeed a market for these people and market prices and financing available. All of those were present in the Georgetown case. It was the people, and that's what they sold, and it worked. You know, as one of the Georgetown descendants frequently says, Georgetown was on the verge of bankruptcy, and they sold our ancestors, and it worked. You know, Georgetown is alive today and thriving precisely because they got through this tunnel. So it worked.
Thank you. Thank you. Super insightful.
So, Richard, if I could, it's always good to hear your voice and see you and
Good to
listen
see
to you.
Good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, so I just wanted to let people know that Rachel Swarns has written a book called The 272, which I put in the chat. And I think, you know, Richard, you might comment on this. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I think, about this history is that in this sale, as in so much of this history, there were dissenting voices, right? That there were, and I think it's important, you know, that they didn't prevail.
Right.
And even those dissenting voices, I think, you know, have a record that's somewhat dubious. But I think, you know, there was some so there were some painful conversations, and this was a result of an ongoing process. That there's to our historian friend, there's a great deal of detail in this book about what went on. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such an important. David and I are good friends, as you probably have guessed, and have shared a number of meals and long conversations about this topic. I consider David one of my mentors in this field. David, you're wearing your Georgetown sweatshirt. Thank you. I appreciate that. He's a Georgetown alumnus. But anyway, you know, I really don't have a lot of patience with the argument that, you know, they didn't think, they, meaning the people in the past, the owners, didn't think they were doing anything wrong. People at the time knew it was wrong. I mean, let's begin with the Black people. They definitely knew it was wrong. And to exclude their moral judgment is just to reify, you know, the original sin. So, you know, and again, when people say, well, it was legal at the time, it's not among Black people. If they'd been, you know, if they took a vote, you know, it wouldn't have been legal. But even in the white community, people knew. I mean, there was a counter argument, and this is the height of abolitionism in the 1830s. And in terms of reparations, I mean, the topic of slavery reparations is older than the United States of America itself. I mean, it predates the Constitution and then the Declaration of Independence. So this wasn't like, oh, we didn't know. This was a choice. This was a moral choice that people made. And so it was not done out of ignorance. It was done deliberately. And to David's point, both there's archival evidence of the awareness of wrongdoing, both in the Black community, the people who were sold, their voices survive, filtered, but nevertheless survive, and also among people at Georgetown and the Jesuit order itself. So this idea that, oh, you know, they thought, you know, everything was hunky punky is just it's just not historically accurate.
I saw someone's hand over here. Bailey, I think you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Beverly.
Hi.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Bailey. Nice to see you.
You as well. Thank you. I have what I think might be a little bit of a two-part question, maybe. around the work of the Georgetown program, as you were identifying living descendants, how did your team prepare to have these conversations? And I'm thinking about the emotional, legal, spiritual challenge of the note or phone call, however it was that this information was delivered. How did your team prepare for that? And on the flip side, what were some of the reactions that you received?
Yeah, boy, those are great questions. So we just jumped in with both feet. We didn't have a flow chart, we didn't have scripts, we didn't have bullet processes, we didn't consult counsel. Um, we met people. Sometimes it's lunch, or sometimes it's just a telephone call. We again, I'm Catholic. I'm not a very good Catholic. Georgetown is a Catholic university. We're a church of sinner believers. I think we were anchored in that idea that so we certainly approached it with humility. You can't really do this work out of fear. If you're afraid, you really just shouldn't. Sort of like being a surgeon. I would not want my child or myself to be operated by somebody who's afraid of being in the operating room. And you just can't do this work, out of fear. You have to do it out of love and genuine curiosity. I mean, people ask me all the time, well, why did you read out? I'm not a saint. I'm not even, a social justice warrior. I'm just sort of until recently, was a moderate Republican. Now I'm an independent. I reached out to these families out of genuine curiosity, and I wanted to know the people. So what were the conversations? So we would call people. Every call was like the very first time. There were frequently tears on both sides of the call. Very difficult. It was a little bit like Groundhog Day that, even though we'd made dozens or hundreds of these calls, for the person we're calling, it's the very first time their history has been sort of shared with them. I think it was shocking. Many people, many of my GU 272 cousins say they just never dreamed they would know who their enslaved ancestors were. One woman said of herself, she said, "I'm stubborn. Do I come from a long line of stubborn people? Am I the only stubborn person? Is stubbornness what allowed us to survive? Or, is it just something that's going to get me into trouble?" I mean, it's sort of a real, yearning for identity and connectedness. And to have this information, finally come to light was just something that many people didn't expect. It was typical that after the initial meeting or phone call, 6 months would go by with no further contact. The family was just processing the information and processing it as a family in a multi-generational way. And that's always very, very complicated. The oldest generation, the true elders, tend to not want to talk about this. People in their middle ages, middle years, want to talk about it. Most young people are young people, and they want to see their friends or go to the movies or do whatever it is that young people do today. So not an enormous amount of interest, but and frankly, it was mostly the women who in the GU 272 community are sort of the kin keepers who are sort of aware of some of the shreds of strands of this history. But and then even when the family sort of re-engaged, the focus was always, overwhelmingly about the ancestors. I mean, I frequently would say to people, these families don't give a damn about Georgetown. They don't, they've lived for decades, centuries without Georgetown. Their primary focus was tremendous love and awe and respect and admiration for their ancestors. Now, intermixed in that was some anger at the church and at Georgetown, and at slavery in general. But again, I would say that when people did come around, it's because and they certainly didn't want to, affiliate with Georgetown. It's not like, I always said to Georgetown, it's not like our dental school alumni or our football alumni. This is not a subsidiary of the university. This is a peer group of people. This is the descendants of Georgetown enslaved people, and they are not subsidiary to the university. They do not take their guidance from the university. They are a peer to the institution. So, I always say that Georgetown had a seat at the table, but it didn't own the table. It came to the table as a peer with these families, and that each and every family, had its own set of reactions. So I know that's a little bit wandering, but it was a very, intensely human, highly varied, ancestor-centric, family-centric reaction.
Any other questions or comments?
Maybe a question about, I think somebody indicated an interest about the Lanier family. Did somebody have a question about the Laniers?
I did. I did. And Alex, thank you for putting the actual name of the book in the chat. Yeah, that's that article. So no, I just wondered, Richard, I know, you've been doing a lot of work and at Harvard, and I think I hope it's going well, but I just wanted to ask you a little bit about, the students at Harvard have been very concerned and animated about the case of Tammy Lanier and Papa Rente. And I'm wondering, whether the students have been in touch with you in terms of trying to think about how to organize their efforts, and B, if you have a sense of how that case kind of compares, right? There's a different set of facts and a different set of issues, but kind of thinking about how it compares to the situation at Georgetown as it unfolded.
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that. Yeah, I frequently receive outreach and contact from Harvard undergraduates. In fact, I recently became a full and active and current member of the Harvard University band. I play the clarinet, so I see undergraduates on a regular basis, and they share their ideas and their thoughts with me and their questions. Sort of like at Georgetown. It's interesting, I'm 61 now, so I'm very interested in what young people have to say. As you say, at both Georgetown and Harvard, they're like, this is a no-brainer. Our university, is built on the stolen labor and wealth of these families. Why is this morally complicated? I mean, they understand that it's logistically complicated. What do we do? When do we do it? How do we do it? What do people want? All of that. But they don't think it's morally complicated. The undergraduates at Harvard and at Georgetown are just kind of shake their head at the older generation who, kind of makes arguments that are falling flat, and some of them are really kind of ludicrous, like, well, Georgetown, or Harvard didn't make a lot of money off of this, as though somehow this was like about profit margins, that it's excused because, it wasn't a good business. I mean, that's kind of ludicrous. That it's in the past. Again, I showed you that picture of that little girl who lived in Berkeley, California in 2003. That's, I know Georgetown descendants who knew enslaved people, and now they're in their 60s and 70s, and the enslaved relative they knew died at a very old age, but they knew enslaved. So these are people living today who actually knew, when they were little boys and girls, knew people who had been enslaved. I think undergraduates really don't have a lot of patience for that kind of thinking. On the flip side, Lanier versus Harvard College, Lanier versus Harvard College is a decision of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. Anybody is free to talk about it and read it and understand it, and I don't hold myself any different. And I mean, not only do I think, I think it would be wrong for any employee or anybody affiliated with Harvard not to be aware of the law of Massachusetts as it applies to our institution. And as I said, anybody can read it. So I happen to have a law degree and I've read it. and it's an extraordinary decision. I will say that I don't think it's sort of widely known within the college. You know, Harvard is not a private university. Harvard is a state chartered university. It's has its own little paragraph in the Massachusetts Constitution, and the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court took the extraordinary step of prescribing as the law of this Commonwealth that Harvard has a duty of reasonable care when dealing not just with people who are direct descendants, but people who think they might be direct descendants. And actually, the opinion goes on to say that condescension, arrogance, rudeness, and just sort of outright dismissal does not meet the duty of care, which is really kind of extraordinary. But I guess what I'm trying to say is the undergraduates themselves have this sort of welcoming, inclusive approach to the descendant community, but don't seem to be aware that the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court has actually articulated in a landmark decision precisely that approach. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. Nevertheless, I think the Lanier family has done not just Harvard University, but many institutions throughout the country a tremendous service of putting on the books a landmark decision about what precise duties in the modern era one of these institutions owes to the direct descendants or descendants in general of people that they once enslaved. I mean, that is just an extraordinary achievement. And I think it may take some time before that decision and its full implications reverberate across this country. You know, what it particularly means in the case of the Lanier family, I don't have opinions. I'm not involved in that. I'm not on the legal staff at Harvard. I'm not trying to influence that case. But the general principles are plain for anybody to read, and they are principles deduced from Massachusetts law, which all of us are expected to know and have opinions about. So I've shared mine.
Anyone else before we end? Wonderful. Richard, thank you so much for the informative presentation. For me, it was very compelling and captivating. We really appreciate you being with us here today. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. And you know, since we're all family here, I'm going to assume this is the start of many, many conversations. And so I'm not going to say goodbye, but I will say, you know, again, it's been a pleasure and a privilege. And I just look forward to continuing these discussions, both individually and collectively.
Yeah, that's the only way we're going to learn, by having these discussions.
Exactly.
And understand each other. So that's
Yeah.
great. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Richard.
Bye-bye.
Before we end, do we have any veterans in the audience? Any veterans? Wonderful. Dennis told me he wanted me to take this time, and he's a veteran as well. So he wanted me to take this time to thank you for your service, since we just had Veterans Day the other day. Thank you so much for your service and your sacrifice for all of us. Thank you very much. And as I close, I just want to remind you that in December, we will have our speaker, Barbara Brown, the founder of Hidden Brookline, with us. So she'll be with us in December, and I hope that you can join us. Everyone, I hope that you have a wonderful and blessed Thanksgiving. That's coming up sooner than we think, about 2 weeks now. And we all have lots to be grateful for and thankful for. So thank you so much on behalf of Slave Legacy History Coalition. I thank you for being here with us this afternoon, this morning, and have a good rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Much love to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Enjoy the dog. Bye, everybody.